Hi everybody, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, the 2nd of October, where I'm going to try to catch up a little bit. I've fallen a little bit behind, as you can see, with the course outline, though I encourage you to keep up with the readings because eventually I will be catching up. And I wanted to talk about Rose for Emily, which we began last class, as well as the 3 short stories that I assigned afterwards. You notice I assigned them all as a group, so we're beginning to speed up a little bit. Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. And as you know, our first paper is going to be on short story. I had selected a mid-date of the semester, around October 23rd or so, for the paper to be due, but I encourage early papers. I've got a rolling deadline. The sooner you hand in the paper, the better. Though, if you are going to be writing a paper about a text that we have not yet discussed, I suggest that you wait until we've discussed it because that will probably help inform some of your arguments. But my hope is that within the next couple of classes or so, we will be done talking about short story. That doesn't mean that we won't be reading other texts. We'll move forward with drama, obviously, but your writing assignment will be on short story. And as you know, it's a critical paper. You shouldn't be referencing outside sources. So based on your own interpretations and analysis, approximately 4 to 5 pages, double space, but as long or as short as it needs to be for you to have a good argument. And you do have to write about one of the short stories from the short story fiction section. I had supplied a couple of topics, whether or not you wanted to talk about canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics worth literary study, and identify a text that you think should or should not be part of the canon. In other words, that's a question that's asking you to evaluate the quality of a text. Or to talk about contemporary relevance, to identify a text that either does or does not have contemporary relevance today. Obviously, both of the questions I've suggested are not questions that have definitive right or wrong answers. It's more about debate and reasoning and argumentation. And in fact, next class, I'm going to talk about some specifics about how to write a paper. But first, I wanted to try to catch up today with talking a little bit about the short stories that we've been discussing. And as you know, whenever I can find these short stories or any of the pieces of literature as links online, I will provide that to you, as I provided in the notes below this video, section 1 for Rose for Emily. And we talked about the conventions of reading a text, that you need to really spend time thinking about the date so you know where you are, because that's going to be important in terms of understanding the story. You need to think about the author, because if you know anything about the author, that'll probably help inform some of your perspectives. And I believe that we talked a little bit about the plot, which is told in a mixed chronology, in other words, out of order, done very deliberately to hide the ending. And actually, there are 2 endings. The first ending is that, yes, Miss Emily killed Homer. And the second ending, for anybody who might have anticipated that first ending, even with the mixed chronology, is that Emily has kept that body and has been lying next to that body years after Homer was killed because of the iron gray hair. We talked, I believe, a little bit about the Southern Gothic tradition. About the Gothic is a convention of writing that was established really in the 1800s with some famous texts like Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, texts you've probably heard of. And I teach a class on the Gothic. A lot of it is about atmosphere and mood. I always think of Halloween and how Halloween is all about atmosphere and mood. And you usually have things like decrepit castles and shadows and mysteries and possible supernatural elements and death and decay. And then while the convention started in England, as you know, America was founded by the British. So that said, when the British came to New England, which is where we're living today, they used many of those Gothic conventions, and they set their stories either in the United States rather than in Britain, or they didn't give a particular locale at all. Think about something like Edgar Allan Poe. And then there were a group of writers from the South and this is directly related to Rose for Emily, that set their stories in the South of the United States, which has a very sordid history, a very ugly history because of slavery. And this is what William Faulkner is examining. Faulkner being a Southerner himself and acknowledging that his family profited off of slavery, and to his shame and embarrassment, and would oftentimes write pieces about the decay of the South, which is what we see with A Rose for Emily. And Faulkner's interview, which I had assigned, I unfortunately could not find the link for it, occurred in 1959. It's a short interview, it's only a couple pages long. Note that 1959 is years after 1931 when he wrote the story. I think that's something to keep in mind, the length of time that has elapsed. Perhaps that explains some of his responses in his interview, which I find to be rather unsatisfactory and flippant, particularly when his first question is, what is the meaning of the title, A Rose for Emily? And you can see in the notes below, under Rose for Emily, I've suggested that thinking about rose imagery could be helpful to understanding this text. That a rose is definitely a flower. And, flowers are delicate, but they also have thorns and they can hurt. And parallels with Miss Emily perhaps exist. And that roses are oftentimes given for things like weddings or for funerals. And again, parallels with A Rose for Emily exist because ultimately Emily wanted to marry Homer Barron and he refused, we assume. And I'll get to that in a moment. And also, the story begins with a funeral. Roses are oftentimes given in tribute, and A Rose for Emily might be seen as a kind of tribute for what Emily represented, a fallen Southern aristocracy. Notice how I'm suggesting that Emily is more than just a literal character, that she suggests something. Chances are, when most people hear rose, they think of the red rose, though roses can be multiple colors. But red brings forth all kinds of associations with passion, violence, blood. All of those would be applicable to things in A Rose for Emily. Roses are oftentimes kept as mementos. In fact, they're dried out and even pressed between the pages of a book. And one might say this is how Miss Emily treats Homer, as that she keeps him as a memento and dries him out. The color rose also is technically not red or white. It's more of a pink. And that might be important, especially because references to that color exist at the ending of the story, and in terms of describing some of the furnishings in the room in which Homer is kept. So not the purity of white, not the evil of or the associations of evil or sin of red, something in between. So we see something that's perhaps complex, ambiguous. And also rose is a verb. It's the past tense of rising, something that certainly men would do in Southern aristocratic circles, where they would stand up and rise in the presence of a woman, particularly a Southern aristocrat, like what Emily is. And she's basically gained her status and her former fortune, she doesn't have it anymore, through slavery. And of course, that system has been dismantled, and we see how she's continuing to try to hold on to this, dare I say, dead past, much like she continues to surround herself with dead things. And I think that that's also a wonderful way of viewing this particular text. And I don't know if Faulkner's response to that, it was just simply A Rose for Emily, that her lover thwarted her, so she killed him. I don't see that as terribly satisfactory. Just to illustrate that an author doesn't necessarily have to provide the definitive answer to a text. In fact, we can even disagree with the author, as long as we have evidence from the text itself in order to support our particular arguments. So, lots of foreshadowing in this piece. So when you put it all together, the family insanity, the domineering father, Emily's denial of death for her father. She holds on to his corpse for 3 days, and 3 is oftentimes associated with Christian Trinity, and certainly the idea of breaking the laws of God and man is something that Faulkner talks about in his interview. She directs everyone to Colonel Sators because he has forgiven her taxes as a way to show her a certain level of kindness, I suppose, or perhaps as a way to avoid confrontation with her because now that her father is dead, she can't afford to pay her taxes. So he invents a lie that the father had loaned the town money and now they're paying it back by forgiving Emily's taxes. Well, eventually Colonel Sators dies and a new generation takes over. They want their taxes. And Emily not only refuses, but tells them to go to Colonel Sators, who's been dead for quite a while. So obviously she has difficulty accepting death. And of course, we know with Homer, and we're told, that he liked men. I think that's less about sexual orientation and more about the fact that he didn't want to commit to relationship. But regardless, it honestly doesn't matter because the story is not about Homer. And what the story is about is the fact that Miss Emily has a relationship with Homer, and it doesn't seem like Homer is going to commit to her, so she's going to keep him forever. A very cliche story that we might have seen perhaps in media previously. But what makes it not cliche is the mixed chronology and all of the possible symbols. That this is more than just about a thwarted lover, that Homer could represent something like the New North because he's a northern laborer who's invading, let's say, the Old South and its ways that might be represented by Miss Emily. And the interviewer with Faulkner suggests these things too. And Faulkner starts talking about himself in the third person, saying, well, I don't know. It wasn't the intention of the writer to say that they were doing that deliberately, but it could be interpreted that way. I'm always somewhat suspicious when you have someone who talks about themselves in the third person. Their little hints and clues, certainly the buying of the arsenic. And then after that, Homer disappears. And then after that, the smell. And I've always been tickled by the idea that the druggist refuses to confront Emily, either because he's intimidated or perhaps he's trying to show her some kindness. I think it's more intimidation than anything, that he just doesn't want to deal with it. So the druggist supplies the reason that Emily doesn't, that is for rats, and that from Emily's perspective, I suppose Homer might be a rat since he refused to commit to her. And again, we see the town refusing to confront Miss Emily. After Homer disappears and a smell comes from her house, they just cover it up. I always find it quite fascinating that Emily becomes so reclusive and nobody takes any action to try to help her. And I think that says a lot about the community. And note that this story is told in the we narration. It's really more about the community than it is about Miss Emily. And that said, the community comes off in a very unflattering, negative way. They're very gossipy. They're very self-centered. They might have a certain level of respect for Miss Emily, but they also take some delight in her difficulties. I oftentimes liken it to how people respond to celebrity, and that they are fans of celebrity, but also take a kind of perverse satisfaction when celebrity experiences downfall, an actor or singer, for instance. Keep in mind that when Emily is buying arsenic, the rumor is that she was going to kill herself, and rather than trying to intervene, the townspeople sits back and watches what happens, almost as if she's the entertainment for them. So, again, the townspeople comes off in a very negative way, and Faulkner does this deliberately to sort of paint the picture of what Southerners are like, a community that would embrace something like slavery. So, as I was suggesting, I think thinking about Emily living in a dead past is one of the ways that you could perhaps view this text, but there's lots of other ways to view this text. Thinking about some of the language in this text, which is problematic, the N-word is used, but it gives us a historical sense of the time period. And Emily's servant is fascinating. Of course, in another time period, it would have been a slave, not a servant. But the servant stays with her. The moment she dies, he disappears. Basically, he's silent throughout the story, imagining the story from his perspective. But as she continues to do things like refusing free postal delivery, as you can see in the notes below, which I kind of liken to perhaps not accepting high-speed internet. Again, she's living in a dead past. She's writing in calligraphy, and this is not a modern way of writing. Trying to teach China painting and China painting was something from the past. The kids don't come by anymore. The decaying house not only represents a decaying Southern aristocracy, and Emily herself, who is decaying, but also a decaying society. And that said, if we began applying all of these conventions of reading and trying to interpret to other short stories, which is what I would like us to do, I have 3 short stories that I wanted us to consider, and they're all very different from one another. One is entitled Young Goodman Brown, and it was written in the 1800s. So the language is going to be seeming very different, very antiquated, but outside of that, not only is it a very famous story and also considered part of the canon usually, but it is an allegory, which means that it's supposed to be representational. So it's no mistake that Young Goodman Brown is named Young Goodman Brown. That not only is that his name, but young represents youth and innocence. And Goodman was a literal term that would have been used at the time, like Miss or Mr. The idea is that he's a good man because he's a Puritan. And brown, which is the color of soil and being sullied or dirtied, which is what Goodman Brown learns in the story, which is all about exposing the hypocrisy of his society, which might not seem like a big deal in 2023, but it would have been in 1835, particularly a society that embraced Puritanism. And that puts us directly into New England and Massachusetts, and something you might have heard of before, the Salem witch trials. So the Puritans were a very strict religious sect in England that basically was subject to lots of discrimination. So they left England and they settled in America, and they created a New England. Hence we are here. And they settled in Massachusetts, and the irony and hypocrisy is that they settled in Salem and they began to practice the same discrimination that had been practiced against them when they were in England. So basically, they targeted, more often than not, women who were viewed as outsiders and labeled them as witches, which led to the great witch trials and burnings and other prosecutions during that time period. The Puritans had a very simplistic view of good and evil. Either you were completely good and you were saved, or you were completely evil and you were damned, and nothing in between. And what we see in Young Goodman Brown is Young Goodman Brown and his wife Faith, and that also is not a mistake. She represents his faith in humanity and his faith in Puritanism, as well as his wife. She basically, and everyone else in the town, seems like they're engaged in some sort of an evil event, a witch meeting. We'll never know for certain. We're not supposed to know. If you're reading this piece in frustration, trying to figure out did the witch meeting occur or not, you're not going to. The author doesn't want us to. The author even says deliberately, had Goodman Brown fallen asleep and dreamt the dream of a witch meeting? And the response is, be it so if you will. In other words, yeah, whatever you want to think. Because it doesn't matter. What matters is that Goodman sees everybody in the town, those he classifies as evil, but more importantly, those he classifies as good and pure and holy, engaged in this journey. And the idea that life is a journey is an old idea that you could see in literature. It's basically what the story is showing. What we're supposed to learn is that while Goodman Brown is destroyed by this knowledge, we should not be, because everyone is capable of sin. And what Goodman Brown is not able to embrace is that he himself is just as sinful as everybody else, or else he wouldn't be on this journey, the same journey that everybody else is on. So he's completely destroyed. His faith is destroyed when he sees the hypocrisy of those around him. And again, even though in 2023 we're a much more jaded and cynical society, think about the disappointment when an authority figure has done something that you think is out of character, whether it be a politician, a parent, a clergy person, a significant other, and how easy it is to lose faith in not only that person, but in other people as well, in humanity as a whole. So that gives you an idea of some of the elements within the story, and you can see in the notes below that I've included some elements that I'll be talking about next class as well. And if we move to the next story, which is Soldier's Home, this was written in 1925 in reference to World War I, the First World War, and it was thought that we would never repeat those mistakes. Sadly, we have. There was a Second World War. And every time I have taught this story, there's always been at least one war happening on the planet, if not multiple wars. So usually we talk about the greatness of literature being timeless and universal. I wish war was not timeless and universal. But with Ernest Hemingway, it's pretty clear that what Krebs, who is a soldier who is returning home from war, is experiencing is what many soldiers still experience. We have modern language to talk about this. We talk about PTSD, the time it would have been shell shock. But in 1925, this really wasn't a subject of conversation. War was a patriotic duty for soldiers, and they were expected to reacclimate back into society as soon as they returned. And that's certainly not what happens with Krebs. All kinds of hints and clues there. Again, if we were to study and analyze this text, Krebs is his surname, and he's continually referred to his surname because soldiers are referred to by their surname. It removes their individuality. And we see also that Krebs in German, and I believe this was referenced in one of the ending questions of the text, means cancer. And one could say that war is a cancer. And this sense of how Krebs is home, but yet not home because he's not understood. And can you really return home again? And perhaps it's not so much that home hasn't changed, but that Krebs has changed. And now he questions everything. He questions religion, even though he went to a Methodist college previously to the war. And obviously religion is of great importance to his family, especially his mother. He questions the civilians who don't have a hero's welcome for him merely because he returned late, as if his service was somehow diminished by the fact that he didn't return at a particular point in time from the war. He questions the world of work and is really not interested in getting a job, and spends most of his time engaged in hobbies that are rather solitary. He's reading, and he's playing pool. Playing pool is quite deliberate because you shoot in pool, and of course he would have been shooting in the military. Practicing the clarinet, reading books about the war. This is where he gets validation for what he did. He wants no consequences, especially with relationships. One assumes that there were so many consequences in war that he doesn't want this anymore, which is why I think, one of the reasons why this text tends to be one that is popular amongst readers. It's also dialogue driven, and anything that's dialogue driven is usually easier to read. And Hemingway was very known for wanting to be precise and concise. So everything means something. So that opening picture that's contrasted between him in college with the fraternity boys all wearing the same style and high collar, to the picture of him in the military. These are two organizations, fraternities and military, that are known for, striking away individuality. And the fact that Krebs seems too big for his uniform. Perhaps he's outgrown some of the cliches and the romanticism associated with the military that would have been promoted, especially during this time period. You can't see the Rhine. That was the way the military was, perhaps still is promoted. Go see the world. And that the girls were not pretty in the picture. And this was yet another way that the military was promoted, that this would be a way for basically to have relationship. And of course, the time period says so much about the idea that the assumption is that the soldier is male, and that the assumption is that his sexual preference would be female. Obviously, things are much more complex than that, but again, we're talking about 1925. So I think that these pieces are great historical lenses into what was considered to be standard and normal in society. So just from a historical perspective, I think it's important to read these pieces. That said, one of Krebs's dialogues that sounds perhaps quite out of place is the conversation he has with his sister when she asks, "Will you be my beau, my boyfriend?" And he says yes. And certainly she's not being serious. I think of this more as hero worship. She's quite young. And perhaps she has more respect for Krebs than anybody else in the family or in his immediate circle. And he can say yes because he knows that that relationship won't come with consequences. This isn't going to be a real romantic relationship. His mother wants him to settle down, as does his father. Note, he never has a direct conversation with dad. It's always through mom. Get a car, get a job, pray. Krebs, there's a big issue about the car that we'll talk about next class, but basically the car comes with strings. And Krebs is well aware of this, that if he takes the car, something he wasn't allowed to have previous to the war, then there will be expectations of him having a relationship and settling down and getting a job. At the end, he decides he's going to go to Kansas City and get a job. Whether or not we see this as a positive, that he's cutting his losses. He realizes that his family will never change, so he may as well start a new life. Or we see this as a negative because he's running away, or perhaps a combination of the two. I like the ambiguity in the ending here. But we do know that Krebs is struggling to find a home and trying to find himself and trying to find validation. And then if we were to continue on and go to the last story, and in some ways it's perhaps the most challenging because it's really a chapter of a novel entitled Invisible Man, not the science fiction story of somebody becoming literally invisible. But Invisible Man was a novel that was written that in the 1950s that talked about how minorities, particularly black men, were viewed as invisible. Because they were seen merely for the color of their skin. Again, think of the time period and how daring it would be for a black author, which is what Ralph Ellison was, to write this story about the degradation and the humiliation that was oftentimes quite commonplace in society against blacks. And that said, the first chapter of the novel was published as an independent story called Battle Royal. So we can read that first chapter, which we are, though I can tell you that we can learn a lot more about, or we can understand, I should say, a lot more about that first chapter if we were to read the novel as a whole. Basically, at the beginning, we're told that this individual or narrator was never given a name, and that's important, much like we talked about with The Sorrowful Woman. It takes away individuality. That the narrator views himself as an invisible man, and he needs to explain why. And this goes back to when he was younger, specifically when he graduated from high school. So this is an adult that's looking back on their history. And we hear what happens in the short story, Battle Royal. What happened to him when he graduated from high school? That he was invited to give his graduation speech to some of the leading citizens of the town. And they all were Caucasian and they all were male. And he was quite excited to do that because he thought that he could prove to them that he was superior to others in his race, and that ultimately he deserved a certain level of honor and a certain level of respect. What the Invisible Man learns in this episode is that this has all been a setup, that the speech is just a pretext for him to get there, to set up the Invisible Man to engage in a literal boxing match with his peers. And the boxing match is symbolic for the kinds of battles that the disenfranchised have to fight every day in society. But this is also a literal battle. And prior to that boxing match, the Invisible Man is taunted and tortured with a naked female. And this could have resulted in death at the time for a black man to be looking at a white woman, let alone a nude white woman. And because all of the boxers are wearing boxing shorts and nothing else, their physical excitement is pretty obvious. So they're in a horrific situation here. And we see how the white woman is treated, in effect, like a piece of meat. She's degraded and humiliated. So it isn't just about race. We see gender as well investigating this particular story. And then after the boxing match where they had been promised some compensation, it turns out that too was false. They have to go on an electrified rug. And this idea of electricity, which represents power, is a major theme in the novel. And they find out it wasn't real money, it was merely tokens for a car dealership. And then the Invisible Man finally is able to give his speech. And despite all of these horrors, the Invisible Man is still excited to be able to prove his intellect. And no one is listening to the speech until the Invisible Man makes a misstatement and says, instead of social responsibility, which is what he's supposed to say, he says social equality. Well, everything stands still at that point, and of course the Invisible Man is confronted, and he says that it was just a terrible error. He was swallowing blood. That's literal and figurative there. And after they've established that they think they can trust the Invisible Man, that he didn't do it on purpose, they present him with a scholarship, which seems to be a good thing, to the, quote, Negro College, unquote. That happens to be embedded inside of a briefcase. The Invisible Man goes home and he has a terrible nightmare that features his grandfather. And we're told about the grandfather earlier on in the story, and how on the grandfather's deathbed he had said that basically he'd been living a lie, that he was pretending to be meek and submissive, but that was really his way of being subversive, of being able to gain access into a society that wouldn't give him access. The Invisible Man didn't understand it when the grandfather died. The Invisible Man will understand this as an adult, but at this point, after being given the scholarship, and he's about 17, 18 or so, he doesn't understand, but he's haunted by his subconscious through this nightmare of his grandfather taunting him. And again, the N-word is used, and the grandfather's saying that, you're never going to be stopping, you're running. And that he basically is almost like a hamster on a treadmill. He's never going to be able to get access in society. And that gives you a sense of the idea of what happens in Battle Royal. We'll talk about it some more. And some of the ways that this short story is able to maintain the elements of a short story throughout a novel. Again, we aren't reading the novel. The novel is 400 or so pages long, so I didn't think we would have the ability to do that. But every detail has importance. So something minor like a briefcase, which represents success and represents a professionalism. That's one of the reasons why the scholarship is embedded in the briefcase. The scholarship is wrapped in white tissue paper, and the images of black and white are so important in the story and the novel. And also the idea that the tissue paper is so thin that really it's not significant. It's not real. It's not something that's sturdy, and neither is the opportunities that the Invisible Man thinks he will have. Because I can tell you about the rest of the novel very briefly, that for about 200 pages or so after he's presented with this scholarship, he does go to college thinking that this will be an opportunity for him to gain access and equality. And he finds out that it was a lie, that the system has been set up in such a way that he would never be afforded access or opportunity merely because of the color of his skin. So he decides that what he needs to do is to enter into the political arena to try to change the system, which is rigged. And he spends about 200 pages or so, give or take, and trying to change the political system. And he realizes the political system is rigged, and there's no way he's going to be able to change it purely because of the color of his skin. And then he runs into a character named Ross the Destroyer, who lives up to his name. He's a destroyer. And Ross convinces the Invisible Man that rebellion and revolution is really the only way to change the system. So the Invisible Man joins Ross, and they try to overthrow society. The novel comes close to an end when they've instigated a riot and they see their own neighborhood burning around them. And the Invisible Man realizes that that's not the solution either. He's just hurting himself and his own people. So he decides what he needs to do is to think. He goes to, as he calls it, hibernate. And think about what the term hibernate means, is that you go underground to consider, but eventually you will reemerge. He goes to an all-Caucasian neighborhood that he would never be allowed to live in, and he breaks into a basement. And in that basement, he's surrounded by darkness because it's a basement. And of course, we could say the Invisible Man has always been surrounded by darkness. And he, however, lights up the basement with hundreds of electric lights. He's stealing power from the power company. Again, that's a symbol about stealing power. Who has it? Who doesn't? As he begins to contemplate what is the answer. And we're never provided with the answer because in 2023, we're still struggling with the answer. If it were easy to provide the answer, the author could have provided it, and then we could eliminate some of the great social ills of our society, such as racism or sexism or classism. The author is really encouraging us to consider, what is the answer? And perhaps, in 2023, we found partial answers because we live in a different society now than certainly the Invisible Man lived in. But these are only partial answers at best because there still is this ugly underbelly that oftentimes is not an underbelly of racism in our society and classism and sexism and many of the other isms that we talk about. What I find quite interesting about the Invisible Man is that even though in Battle Royal, he's very young and very naive, almost like Goodman Brown. He needs to learn something. This is another coming-of-age journey story. There are little hints throughout the story that he is being subversive, not just with saying social equality, but also at one point all of the boxers are blindfolded. Again, a great symbol for how, the citizenry isn't allowed to see the truth. They're blindfolded from the truth. And the Invisible Man peeks outside of the blindfold. The Invisible Man tries to protect the woman who's being degraded and humiliated. In fact, the Invisible Man even tries to topple the chair of one of the drunk leaders of the society, or the seeming leaders of society. All of these are small acts of rebellion. And it does remind me of young Goodman Brown because these are supposed to be the elite and the respected of society, but we see what they do behind closed doors, which is absolutely horrific. So look at the details, even something like the tattoo the woman is wearing, the tattoo the woman is displaying, an American flag right above her navel. She's supposed to represent the American dream, hence the American flag tattoo, where these men can look, but they can't touch. They can never have it. It's unrealistic for them, purely because of the color of their skin. And instead, rather than fighting against the system that's oppressing them, they fight against each other for crumbs, in effect. One might say that this is a great parallel economically of what happens in our current society, where the very wealthy basically are taking advantage of the populace, while we, perhaps all of us, struggle for the crumbs against each other rather than addressing the true inequality that exists with just a handful of individuals having an enormous amount of wealth. So these are just 3 stories that I'll give you some more details about. I'm cognizant of the time, however. And I wanted to get a sense this time of quotation, not about Rose for Emily, but now that I'm expanding things a little bit, where you've got a little bit of choice, either Young Goodman Brown or Soldier's Home or Battle Royal, you choose. Choose what you think is an important quote in one of these short stories and indicate why. And that would be due on Wednesday the 4th. Of course, if you need additional time, please ask me. And you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn, as you're well aware. And this will give you a good idea of what we would be talking about in class if we were having a face-to-face class. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, though I can admit that I'm feeling a little bit sluggish and a little bit achy because I had my vaccination yesterday, but my booster. But I can tell you it was definitely worth getting that booster, and I encourage you to do so as well. None of us wants to have a repeat of what we went through in 2020. So again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class, putting some closure onto these 3 short stories. I will talk a little bit about the conventions of writing a paper. And you'll see that there are only 2 short stories left, if that, Actually, there might just be one short story left. I'm not sure. But at any rate, we are getting towards the ending of our short story unit. Just one, Popular Mechanics. And then the last short story, before we start moving into a new topic, which happens to be drama. Again, take care. Bye-bye.